Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's presentation of Language and Games. I'm Rebecca Roberts. I'm the curator of programming at Planet Word. This is a brand new series we're inaugurating this evening. So I want to introduce the founder of Planet Word, Ann Friedman, to welcome you all.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good evening, everybody. I'm Ann Friedman. And thank you for tuning in and welcome to Language and. It's the first of what we hope will be a long-lived series of monthly programs. It's designed for everyone who is fascinated by language and how it's shaping and being shaped by our world. We want to thank the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Foundation for providing funding in support of this series. We've named the series Language and because it will explore the intersection of language and many seemingly unconnected disciplines. Of course, it's hard to separate words from almost any human endeavor, but we hope that this series will illuminate connections you've never thought of before. The mere fact that we can organize such a series on everything from language and games to climate change to zombies tells you a lot about how the field of language and language studies is evolving. Think back a few decades. Learning about language back then meant learning rules and grammar and do's and don'ts. It meant using standard English only and taking a dim view of those who didn't use proper English. I went all the way down that prescriptivist path and became a copy editor. I thought linguistics was basically the study of language structure, and the end goal was fluency and correct usage and figuring out what Chomskyism was. So imagine what a new world I encountered when I started talking to people about what content to include at Planet Word. I met a lot of linguists, for sure, but they also had deep knowledge of fields ranging from engineering to computer science, to speech language pathology, to neuroscience, from ethnolinguistics to anthropolinguistics to forensic linguistics. There was a whole new world, a whole new wider angled way to view the field. And linguists were welcoming innovation and broadening their field. They considered texting and emojis and animal communications. Poets were also trying new things, spoken word and hip hop. Lin-Manuel Miranda was inventing a whole new model of musical theater. We found ourselves living in the middle of a veritable renaissance in the world of words and language. Our hope is that this Language and series will open that whole new world to you. We look forward to bringing you many engrossing and illuminating language and programs in the months to come, as well as our usual slate of book talks and other word-related programs. And now, to bring you tonight's inaugural program on language and games, here's Rebecca again. If you tuned in before, you know her delightful, engaging interviews have made her the charming voice of Planet Word. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Ann. And thank you everyone for being part of this inaugural episode of Language and. As Ann mentioned, it's going to be monthly. We have Language and Climate set for March. April is Language and Food. May is Language and Gender. There's just really nothing that language does not intersect with. So we are very excited to dive into expertise in all of those other fields. So Language and Games is our topic tonight, and our guests are Catherine Himes and Hakan Sayılıoğlu. And Catherine is a linguist by training, and Hakan is a cryptographer by training, and together they are Thorny Games. And they are here to help us talk about the intersection of language and games. Catherine and Hakan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us. We're stoked to be here.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks for having us.
So how did you two, with your varying backgrounds, come together to decide that gaming was where you wanted to combine forces?
Yeah, yes. linguist cryptographer meets and then form a game studio.
First and then form a game studio.
There was a marriage in between. So we're life partners. But what really was interesting is just, I guess, how we found games, and more just that there is this vibrant world of games that are happening right now, this golden age of gaming. We ourselves are longtime board gamers that started as a hobby and eventually kind of crept into other parts of our life. We eventually made the pilgrimage to the biggest game convention in the world, Gen Con. And when we were there, we found this community of game designers, game makers, especially people who are tinkering with story games that just welcomed us, spoke to us. And when you find other people that give you that kind of energy and inspiration, like you immediately want to be part of them. And so that kind of kicked off both our like tumbling down the rabbit hole of games, but then eventually just thinking about how we combine our passions into games themselves. And
because really these games are something like we had never seen before, right? They're generally called like indie role-playing games or story games, where most people might now be familiar with tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, where you're embodying a character and accomplishing some mission. But these were much more free-form, like they were about telling new and different and weird kinds of stories. And we just fell in love with them during that convention. And then it was after that as we were thinking of how we wanted to creatively contribute, that really we were able to bring language in. And we saw that language was such a great way to explore so many different topics in gaming that we brought it in. And that's kind of been the focus of the studio since.
So how is gaming as a storytelling medium? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses?
Games are so powerful. I'd say in terms of strengths, it's fundamentally they're interactive. And because games are interactive, they're persuasive in a different way than other forms of media. You are doing things, you're thinking things, you're making choices and actions. And when you design a game, you're designing a system, a rule set, a way that the world is working. And when you invite someone into that system to pretend or play or do an activity, it's like you're creating a little world. And that's powerful in and of itself, because you can get people to do things like collaborate, communicate in ways they wouldn't otherwise. And so all of this kind of collective action is possible through games that would be really hard to do without them. And there's whole things that we could talk about in terms of using games in different areas of life and in sneaky, clever ways. But just on its surface, they're also fun, engaging, and that makes them a really interesting medium to focus in on as a creative canvas. But language in games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just add a couple things about the games thing in general too. One thing that is really special about it is that, especially in the way that we think about games, it lets players bring in and explore what they're interested in exploring at that point in time, right? Because they're very freeform. You get to define what you are kind of interested in, what lens you want to look at the game through. And so, whereas a movie or a book, you'll bring your own perspective and how you're interpreting the piece, but in a game, you're fundamentally part of the creation process, right? We've given you the rules, but like the instance of this thing happening is defined by the players. And also because it's not just one player, it's really something that's being created by all the people around the table at once. And so it's a story that none of us would have been able to come up with on our own, that we are able to get into together. And then, the language component of it too, there's a whole bunch of reasons why we thought language was such a great fit. Most of all, because we're so naturally good at it, right, from a lot of ways. In terms of one of the most impressive things I'll do in a day is have a conversation, but we don't think of it that way. But like when we think of how hard it is for machines and AI to do different things, right, language has proven to be one of the most difficult things for them to get up to. And so it's this like incredible talent that we all have that we tend to take for granted, maybe not so much with the Planet Word audience in terms of like the general population, but most people don't think of it as an amazing thing they're doing on a daily basis. And with games, then you're able to get this thing that people are incredibly good at and get them to play around with it. And doing things that you're good at and exploring it in new ways is something that can be very satisfying. So.
Yeah. People in the chat want you to introduce the cat.
Yes, okay.
Oh.
This is one of them. This is
Yes,
Tarski. This is, they've all decided that they want to be part of this conversation too.
Except for this very moment. Like in the last 15 seconds, the other one left. They have just a sixth sense for being in trouble.
trouble.
We'll introduce the other one when
We
you
have
come.
all been there.
So as you had mentioned before, my background is in cryptography, and before that I was a mathematician. And so as was Kate also did mathematics. And so they're named after Banach and Tarski, which is a famous, not quite paradox, but interesting example in kind of mathematical reasoning, like some of the bizarre results you get when you do certain types of mathematics.
Excellent.
But, yeah, sorry.
So I want to go back to something you said about gaming giving you sort of the flexibility to create something and build what you are interested in, because games have a lot of rules. I mean, I think that if you're a traditional board game player, you think of it as a very prescribed universe. And there's only so many things you can do. There's only so many ways your piece is allowed to move. There's, and so I'd like you all to sort of tell us a little bit more about the kinds of games you all are talking about and kind of the world building aspect, because I think that notion that gaming can be a way to tap your own creativity might feel a little bit counterintuitive.
I'm happy to take a crack at it. I think one of the ways that might be helpful for this is if I kind of give an outline of maybe how dialect works as like a very concrete example of like
Dialect is one of your games, we should say.
Yes, exactly. Sorry. So dialect is one of our games in which you're telling the collaborative story of a community through the lens of its language, right? And so I think by giving a little bit of an overview of that, I can kind of explain how we both provide rules and structure, but also players make it their own during play as well, right? So the way dialect works is you're going to tell the story of a community that's in isolation, which can be defined in many different ways by how its language changes over time, right? So the game's going to take place over 3 ages, and each one of those ages, you're going to add new words to the language. Some words might change, some words might be removed. But fundamentally, we're each playing a character within this community that we're defining together. The rules give you the backbone of how to define your community, but then the players, by answering certain questions, really flesh it out. So dialect comes with a variety of backdrops in which the players can tell their story. For example, one is the Martian outpost. So while they're starting the game, they'll say, okay, we're going to play it in the Martian outpost. Then the game asks the players certain questions about like, okay, what's important to this community, right? Like just because they're on Mars doesn't mean that they're all necessarily going to be the same. They may have fled Earth because they were afraid of climate change. They might have been eccentric billionaires who decide to move to Mars, right? Like a whole sorts of different ways in which the players define it. And then after they define the world that they're playing in, they define their characters. So who are you? What role do you play in this world? And the game gives you rules for how to do that efficiently. And then each turn of the game, you'll add words to the language according to a deck of cards, which says like, so you define the aspects of the community, and then by playing a card on an aspect, the players negotiate what they want a new word in the language to be, and then we have conversation where we play it out. So we've given you very broad strokes, right? We've told you kind of the rules for how you interact with the system, but the bones of like, okay, what's this community actually like? Who are the people who live in it? What are the words that they use in this community, and how do you interact with it? Those are all going to be things that the players actually come up with on the spot, right? And so even if you're playing the exact same setting, the exact same rules, the story is going to be virtually unintelligible from one another because so much is left up to the players.
It's almost like a co-authorship relationship, whereas like the point of these games is to tell an exciting story together with other people. And so the rules will help you do that from scratch. Whereas like a board game is more often around optimizing a set of conditions and the states of the board so that ultimately you might win. And there's no winning in these games in the way that we've designed them. The winning is the experience of collaboratively telling a story.
We have a couple of questions about dialect. One person asks what the target age range is, and one says, I'm a very big fan of dialect and I own Sign, but I haven't found those to try it with because it can feel like the barrier to entry is high. What recommendations do you have for those who are interested in the concept of a language-based game, but are nervous about the improv aspect?
Oh, these are great questions. So first, easily, 13 plus is usually what we say, though I have to say that lots of play stories come to us from different players around the world, and it's been played with children, modified, and so there's nothing inherent in any of these games that that make them inaccessible. The other thing that I would say about, especially these kinds of games that involve improv or storytelling, is that there is some amount of sort of creative vulnerability that kind of goes into what it is to, make something up on the spot. And you do need to get the right group to do it. Especially, we found that people who are excited about language are often great folks to do it with. But really, it's amazing how much beginners just have in themselves as a strength. We often find that some of our best games are with people who've never played these types of games before, never done a live action game or role playing, or they've been intimidated by Dungeons and Dragons or things like it, because it turns out that we do this all the time. And too often, I think as adults, we're told to silence that part of ourselves, and children are these founts of creativity, but these games give kind of structure and setting to do them together.
And the one thing I'll say about the sign question too, for folks who are interested in playing that game in particular, so that's a completely silent game, and I think one of the reasons why I really enjoy playing it sometimes is because I can actually find spontaneously coming up with a lot of speech during a game to somewhat be creatively tricky, right? Like to come up with like to do that in that on the spot way. And that game kind of takes you on a journey of not being able to communicate to being able to communicate at the end of it. And so for me, at least, it always feels more creatively kind of easing you into the process than a game that's just like having you go at once. Yeah, and there might be is there some footage of play of it online?
There's some.
Yeah, so you might be able to find, because that's really how games are passed, like these types of games in particular really are passed on now too, right? Streamings, recordings, stuff like that. And so I believe there's some recordings of Sign that we had done at some point to be able to give people that visual kind of context of like, hey, here's what it actually looks like, right? Because you can describe the rules as many times as you want, but until they actually see it, sometimes there's a lot of the like non-written pieces that people just assume that you've osmosed somehow because you know a person who's played the game or something. But so those online recordings can be a very helpful way to get into it too.
You said that it can be really enjoyable if you're someone who's excited about language, which of course is everyone on this Zoom, because we don't know any other kind of people. So I will put the pitch in that dialect is for sale at Plantware. And you did get a shout out in the chat. Somebody said, I've run 2 games of Sign at an annual gaming meetup in the mountains of California. It's been an incredible experience both times, raved about and highlighted as many of the players' favorite parts of the weekend. It's an absolute treasure, and I'm so grateful to you all for making it.
Oh, that's very sweet.
Thank you.
That's not too recent California transplants. Also doubly sweet from that perspective.
So you were starting to touch on this idea of games as being a way to explore other things, not just language, but tapping into a creativity that might have been thwarted or imagining in a way that we don't much get to as adults. What do you think, what else are people gaining from playing with language in this way as opposed to another way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, the interactive nature of it, and depending how a game is designed and what it's meant to do, what its design goals are, is it can help you just internalize, let's say, a story in a different way. Sometimes really games can help you think through a problem, understand a worldview, because you're actually within a system that has rules that may not be the rules that you intuit about the world, but that become the explicit rules of what it is to play. So, maybe even there's some strength in getting a different perspective and interacting with that perspective through the way that it's instantiated within a game that I think is really powerful.
And one of the things that's also just great about it, and I think we touched on a little bit before, is this opportunity to be creative together, right? Like that's just not an opportunity a lot of us have, I think, on a regular basis. Like musicians who are playing together and improvising, or improv actors who are playing, like they all get chances to do stuff like that on a regular basis too. Which is why they call it like improv games and things too. But I'm not a great musician, right? Like I have a really hard time finding outlets to be creative with groups of people, and games really give you a chance to do that. And one of the things that a friend of mine had told me once that like really made me change how I thought about being creative in games and just creative prompts in general is that and this is of course like an incredible oversimplification, but what he had said was, the way that you prompt people to be creative is by giving them 2 points and like seeing how their brain draws the line between them, right? Like, and that subconscious process of being creative and seeing what you do with like completely disjoint things and how your mind connects them, how it makes sense of that distance between them can be really rich. And the language aspect of it and how unconsciously your brain does that can also be really fulfilling too.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I'll add to that too that I think is really powerful is that especially with these kinds of games where you are creating these stories with other people, you can explore parts of your own identity and personality that may not have a space in your normal life. I am a particular person on the Zoom at work with this is my cat Bon, and particular person when I'm holding Bon, but like in a game I can be a character, and explore the way that they would make choices, kind of as a proxy for myself. And I think that it gives you this feeling of being able to live many lives.
Yeah, it's funny because this was a realization that I came about my own game playing at some point, was that I tended to play characters that had a lot of moral certitude in whatever they were doing, like either very bad or very good. It was like I realized at some point I was like, oh, it's because like I'm such a like morally indecisive person on a regular basis, like always second guessing myself. That was really refreshing to like have someone who like to be someone for a little bit of time that just had real convictions about what they were doing, and at least that was a perspective that like I know I got to explore something that like how my brain works on a natural basis doesn't really lend me to exploring that much. But with games, you can do that and live in those shoes for a little bit if that's a comforting thing, or if that's something that's uncomfortable that you want to explore to push yourself and know how it feels to be there for a little bit of time as well.
So the chat is going rogue. They are starting to organize game nights around Dialect.
Oh, great.
Meeting up with each other.
Yes.
Several people have suggested game nights at Planet Word, and I have to say I'm totally down for it. I always hope to host game nights at Planet Word. The only reason we have not done so far is because of COVID. So those of you who are here in the DC area who are agitating in the chat for Planet Word to host game nights, it absolutely is something we very much want to be able to do. And as soon as we feel like we can do it in person, we will. And in terms of organizing it on Zoom, maybe that's something to try as well. So this is my regular pitch to you to sign up for our newsletter or follow us on social media. And as soon as we have game nights at Planet Word, you all will be the first ones to know. So we've talked a lot about what it's like to be a game player and how you can imagine new worlds and try on alter egos and things like that. What about game design? Tell us how you go about creating that space for people.
Ooh,
yeah. Yeah, I can take a first crack at it. And unfortunately, all the answers are going to be very unsatisfactory. Right? It's all going to be like, well, you kind of have like a starting point, and that starting point might be like different, and then you spend thousands of hours on it and like hope you land up somewhere good. Tends to be our design process for most things. And I bring that up particularly because with so the 2 games that we've released so far, Dialect and Sign, and then Xenolanguage, which is Kickstarter, and we're in the process of fulfilling it right now, they all started from very different places, right? Dialect really started from a starting point of some other games that were having players collaboratively build a thing together, and in the process of building that thing, they were telling a story, right? And with Dialect, we just had this like moment of like, well, instead of like drawing a map together, instead of doing this other thing together, what if they were actually building a language, right? Because the language is such a sticky thing. It's such a like, it'll be a lot of fun to come up with these words. After the game's over, the players will have this like secret language they've kind of built with each other and like developed fluency in over the course of the game. Like that sounds amazing. And so like, okay, well, if we're going to make that work, right, what are the other ways in which those other games would have to change? And by the end of it, it's completely unrecognizable from the first day. Whereas another game, whereas Sign was completely different, where it was more of the mechanics that came first. And we're like, okay, well, if we want the players to go on this journey, then like, this is kind of the structure that makes sense as to how they would do it. And then Xenolanguage was just like, wouldn't it be cool to Ouija with aliens? It was kind of but I mean, I'm being a little glib. But
I think that with all of these, there's like, if I'm going to try and it's a very messy process in summary. Like when you spend lots of human creative hours on a thing, you can rough it out into something smooth. But like all of these started with some idea that felt compelling and that we may be able to do something particular and say something interesting about language with it. That was really fundamental to just what excites us as people and designers, because of the background and how powerful language is as a way of in a sideways way, saying deep things about people, identity, culture. And all of our games end up being kind of a love language to, or love letter to sociolinguistics and how language shows up in the way that we interact with the world. And so once you have some idea of something that seems like a compelling thing to play in, and that is exploring some idea in language that feels novel enough, that can be like the spark that gets us going. And then from that process, it is just many hours of system design, idea working, testing it out, game, play testing, letting it fall over, redoing it again. And, it is a winding path to ultimately becoming a thing that exists in the world.
Which though, and just to add a tiny bit onto that, that's one of the things too, because it takes so much time, that little spark being something that's going to motivate you through that entire process is really important. And really the fact that that little spark about what you're making the game excites you as a designer, and that's going to like motivate you to go through the 1,000 hours or whatever. I have no idea if it's 1,000 hours or not, but like the several thousand that takes to make the game. Like that is a much more defining thing about whether or not it's going to succeed a lot of time, right? How much it energizes you to go through the whole rest of the process, at least is how I think about it.
We have a ton of questions from the audience that I want to get to, but before that, I want to talk a little bit about your work using some of the game processes you've developed to work with people with aphasia. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So we are part of an initiative that has been an incredibly just fascinating, rewarding, an awesome collaboration where we have made games called Aphasia Games for Health in collaboration with aphasia support groups, people with aphasia, speech language pathologists, and professional game designers. I should say aphasia, for folks that don't know, is a language disorder or the experience of language loss due to some brain injury, often stroke. And it affects 2+ million Americans every year. And it is a huge barrier to, as you can imagine, actually having social connection, interacting with the world. These are people that have full intellect and are fully engaged in their lives, but otherwise find language to be a barrier. And one of the things that people with aphasia report is that they don't have sufficient healthcare access, especially when it comes to speech language therapy. Oftentimes, like they might get a few hours in the years following a stroke, but that's not enough for what often is a chronic long-term struggle for recovery. And together with speech language pathologists from the University of Pittsburgh, some game researchers at Carnegie Mellon, us as linguists and game designers, but most importantly with the aphasia support group called ARC, Aphasia Recovery Connection, we co-designed a series of games that are based on principles of speech language therapy as part of the inspirational mechanics of the game. So the idea is that you play these games, and these games are doing activities that may be part of a standard speech language therapy regimen. It can be played in support groups, at home, without a clinician. And it can be part of what is just a suite of things that you do as a person living with aphasia and recovering from aphasia.
Yeah, and just to clarify a little bit on that too, we didn't actually design any of these games. We have organized the system, and because it was really important for us for there to be this co-design process between folks with aphasia and professional game designers. So what we did is we organized the system. We ran the collaboration between speech language pathology and the games researchers, where the folks with aphasia kind of paired off in the panel with the game designers themselves, told them what they needed in games, told them what they were looking for, and also participate in the design process as it was going along. So we really tried to have this kind of co-creative effort between folks who actually have aphasia and folks who make games for a living, in order to make things that were actually relevant and useful for them, that they would want to play.
Yeah, and then the folks with aphasia that were a part of this collaboration, one, they already played lots of games. Then they themselves became game designers afterwards, and then sometimes send us some of what they have worked on. And it, and we're just really proud we published at least about our co-design process in an academic journal. And we would love to see more kinds of collaborations like this out in the world, from game designers, from linguists, just from support groups that are coming together and that can use their collective strengths to make something new.
Well, it's interesting. I think the sort of germ of that idea of gaming as sort of brain health, memory retention, warding off Alzheimer's, whatever the sort of headline is, it's out there in the world, you know, especially with word games as a way to sort of concentrate your brain for a few minutes a day, but in a very ad hoc kind of a way. So this idea of taking it on specifically with the community of people who are experiencing the disabilities.
This all reminds you of the brain age games. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
Like the old, where it would tell you like when your brain age was.
Right. I've never understood what the ideal is there, though. At some point,
I have no idea.
Younger and younger. Then you think,
I'm glad I don't have to say. Exactly. I'm glad I've matured past my 22-year-old self. So,
right. And I should also mention, for people who are curious about aphasia, we are at Planet Word developing an experience in the galleries with the collaboration of the American Speech Hearing Association to discuss that a little bit more and have an interactive about that coming up. One of the many things in development at Planet Word. And we've got a couple of questions I want to get to. First of all, here in the chat, one of the people who's asking is teaching a 2-week course on board game creation to high school students. And it says some of this talk would be really great to show them. What advice do you have for that teacher in terms of board game creation and teaching folks how to do that?
So great.
I'm sure they've thought a lot about this process too. But I know that at least in the story gaming community, one thing that's very, very popular is hacking existing games, right? So there are certain games, certain systems that like you can start from as a baseline and then you modify it in different ways in order to kind of explore the experience that you're more excited about at that time. And so you get to like focus in on like, okay, there's this thing where the wheels, the gears and cogs kind of already fit together. And so I'm just going to like push it a little bit to like make it do the thing that I want to do.
I have to plug Dialect also is a game where you can design your own backdrop. So the game actually runs you through a way to think about the rules in the context of a new setting. So it's not quite hacking a game, but it is using the rules of an existing game and modifying them slightly.
And there's some school that did that, right? Where like you did your own backdrop as like an extra credit thing.
I forget which one.
Yeah, but Dialect, there's been a number of schools that kind of tried to, that have adopted Dialect in different ways as well. And some of them have students write their own backdrops as like little hacks as well. But certainly like board games as well, I think there's also great places to start from. great games that can be adopted according to what the kids are interested in.
Yeah, I think the other thing that comes to me is just like maybe define one mechanic or a small number of mechanics, keep it really simple, and then play test early and often. I feel like one of the biggest things as a game designer versus other kinds of creators is that you really have to put it out early in front of other people because interaction is so essential as a part of what you're making. And it is a humbling experience, lots of humility between the two of us. It is a learning experience, and things will work that you don't think, things won't work that you do think. And I think that would be one of the things that would probably really stick with you as a new game designer and will stay with you.
And one thing to add that too, I don't know if we're done spend this much time on this question, Rebecca, but one other thing that's great to set up though is I know the culture and feeling that people have around giving feedback can be really important for having that constructive setting, right? So having that discussion at the beginning of like, hey, like this is how you actually give feedback, right? Can be really important. Like, for example, whenever I'm playtesting a game, I think that this is a good practice. This is normally how, like, who folks who playtested a handful of times will do it, was before they sit down, they'll ask the person whose game it is, like, what type of feedback are you looking for, right? Because sometimes they might be like, look, I've been working on this for 5 years, right? Like, I just want to get it out the door. I want to tweak like a few things along the edges.
You are only allowed to tell me it is perfect.
Well, I mean, you can tell me that, like, hey, you should change these, like, but like, don't tell me to redo the entire thing because, like, I'm not going to do that, right? Like, that's the guy was, and so, but sometimes someone might come with a thing and might be like, look, I made this in the parking lot before coming inside, right? Like, if you think the whole thing should be scrapped and like we can redo like something fundamental, like, cool, great, I am open to that kind of feedback, right? Like. And having that expectation of like establishing the type of feedback that's expected both on behalf of designers and on behalf of players, I think can be really important and might help with the experience as well.
Speaking of adapting your games, I understand that you strive for your games to be language independent, which is amazing to me just because of how much changes in translation. Explain what that goal is and why you're striving for it.
Yeah, I think that we want, like, it just delights us to no end when our games are played by language communities outside of English. And we're lucky in that our games have been translated into a number of languages. So we get play reports from people in Japan, in Korea, it was just released in Korean, to a large community. And that is just a basic thing that we find exciting. But access, I would say, access in design, access in what these in language is a big part of what animates us. And so the idea of designing it to be language independent is thinking about sort of like what are the more fundamental constants that can be shared between languages, and making sure that we keep our games doing and saying interesting things about language, but often rooting those in the hands of the players themselves. So that means that, like, when you play a game of dialect in Korean, you're speaking Korean the entire time, but then you might create your own sub-dialect in Korean. That is the thing that you take away from, and that I think is the big energy there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, none of our games, other than like just translating like word for word the rules, have required any significant modification, except for maybe one page in dialect.
Oh, yeah.
But like that's an optional rule. That one like is a little language dependent, but we can get into that later. But like you don't even have to play with that, and a lot of times, it's completely up to the players. But yeah, it just happened very naturally. I think because so much of our games are about creating language, we just don't have that much about like special language rules in the book to begin with, and so whatever language they're playing in, it tends to work pretty easily.
Well, also, I think it's so interesting that if you're creating new words, how often do people incorporate sounds that aren't in your first language?
Yeah.
I mean, there are sounds that speakers of other languages can't hear in English. So I think it would be so interesting to hear what sounds like a made-up word in somebody else's language. That might not sound like an invented word at all to a different native speaker.
And that's part of the things also that I love, and that we're like so many degrees removed from now with these translations. We're like, you'll run something through Google Translate. We aren't Korean speakers, but that doesn't help, because the only people that understand it or maybe a game testimony that came out of dialect are the people who made that little language themselves, right? And so I think that kind of branch from another language aspect to it, so it's like secret language on top of other language that we don't speak, is exciting.
And like just the way you come up with like different made up words too, like you were saying, like around the sounds, but my first language was Turkish, and like the way you even come up with made up words is kind of special to the language, right? So you have like fixed ways in which like, okay, this is kind of a way that you like make a made up word based on this word, right? And they're all just different. And it's also led to a pet theory of mine that like Kate doesn't like, that like maybe the reason why that like so we've gotten more uptake in certain languages might be because like it's easier to like make up words, or like it resonates more in different languages in certain ways.
I disagree, but
yeah. We can err a little bit of that, but which I am not the linguist, so her opinion is likely the correct one.
But you are the cryptographer, and I think that that's where that intersection is so interesting. I mean, we did a program recently on decoding the Rosetta Stone, and one of the things that came up about the difference between decrypting a code and decrypting language is that languages are hard by accident, right? Codes are hard on purpose. And so, I mean, there are many other differences also, you know, in the whole universe of what the Rosetta Stone could have said. It could have said anything, and you know, intercepted military message only has a certain universe of what it could be about. But that whole notion of the rules, right? And what it is that where your bumper lanes are on what you can create within a language, and English in particular, because we do, you know, mug other languages for vocabulary and loose grammar in their pockets. We're constantly inventing words and borrowing words and stealing words and repurposing words. So it's, you know, it's yet another intersection, language and everything.
Yeah, 100%. Or like, you know, with Turkish, where you just like add stuff at the end of words to make different words, or like, I only studied Arabic for a little bit of time, but like where you have like the root structure for words, right? And like it takes you like a long time studying Arabic before you can even use a dictionary, because like you don't know how words are written in there because of the root structure. And so yeah, there's just like different ways across all these different languages.
And once again, I promised audience questions and got far too wrapped up in all the things I was curious about. But let's start turning to some audience questions. Here's one. How would you recommend a, quote, old-fashioned teacher start learning how to incorporate games in a classroom setting?
Ooh, I think one of the first things I might do is just actually talk with my students. So talk with your students about the kind of games that maybe they are already playing. Games are such a big part of people's lives now. Sometimes even we are floored by how much games are like a behemoth of media. And so just finding out the kinds of games that they play and they're interested in is just one way to open that conversation. The other thing that I can think of is to think around how particular games can be used in relation to whatever it is the subject that you're teaching, and then going to the web and finding other resources for it. We found a lot of people come to us specifically to talk about language and language games, but also anthropology, you know, things broadly connected to language and how games might fit into it. But there's a lot of other makers that I'm sure would be really happy to talk to someone who's thinking critically about bringing games into the classroom.
And like, we're always surprised when we hear about like different ways in which people are incorporating them too. And like, there's so many examples now. Like, you know, I had played in a game of, is it called Reenacting the Past, Recreating the Past? I forget what the system is. Something like that. A great like system for like role-playing historical context for like actually being able to play. Reacting to that's the R word. Reacting to that. But where you're actually playing through historical context according to rules that are provided, things are given, that really have provided great frameworks for it. And like, that's a great one for the history class to do, for example. And I know that like for math and And cryptography in particular, there's a lot of like great, like playful ways in which you can kind of illustrate some of the examples in a very different way, but for which there are examples of like how some educators have already used it that should be available online.
We have a lot of comments and questions about the game. We are all playing Wordle. As you might imagine, for those of us who work at a word museum, we all play it and we are very competitive about it. And all the different variations on it. Speaking of adapting a game, Wordle, a Nerdle, Airportal, which is a new one.
No spoiler space, or can we complain about like
somebody did ask for a hint to today's Wordle in the chat, which I think is really phone a friend. But so why does a game like that, it's so simple, but suddenly absolutely everybody's playing it? What are we getting from Wordle? Why are we all so hooked?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Wordle. We love it. We play it every night actually before going to bed, because typically our bedtime's right after midnight. So that's right when your Wordle comes in.
We may have shifted our bedtime slightly.
To be, oh God, I hate to think of that, but possible. Anyway, there's much ink spilled over Wordle, deservedly. It's a great game. And the things that we think about it, or at least that are really exciting about it to us, and also just to play with it. One, it's a word game. People love language. People love, and also it's an approachable word game. I think that if you haven't played a crossword before, sometimes it feels like its own culture. It's like a big time commitment. Wordle is constrained in that way. This one at a time aspect too, where you know that you only have one thing to focus on at any given day, and then the next thing will happen. I think it has these qualities of this feeling of playing together while apart, where you are an individual playing, but we can still kind of share and talk about it. So it kind of accommodates our pandemic moments when we're separated and all of these kinds of things. But I think two things that are under discussed, perhaps, I don't know. There's lots to say about Wordle, and many people have said it, that I think are, one, just the ritualistic aspect of it. I think a lot of times people have a particular time and place in their life where Wordle has found its spot. For us, maybe at nighttime as this wind down, for other people with their coffee in the morning, and maybe other people live chaotically and don't have that, just the chaos of life. But I think that ritualistic element of wordplay is really powerful. People want rituals, and it's a constrained one. And the other thing I think is that it goes back to some of this brain games thing that we've talked about, where it's this moment of focus where you can at least, kind of try to extend yourself and guess and do a puzzle. That's an approachable one, but it is asking something of you. And I feel very scattered these days. I'm sure you do. And it's like that moment of focus is a powerful thing.
And just one thing to add to that too, I think Wordle is very different if people don't have the same word every day. Yeah. Like that was a really interesting social piece of it. I think, and like seeing everyone's tweets in the green boxes and stuff and trying to like recreate what their guesses were, which is everyone's like favorite like pastime with it, right? So I think all played into it. It was all, very clever.
Now I'm going to describe a tweet, which is clearly the thing that we should do on this Zoom, but there's this amazing tweet of it's an image from the movie Arrival, the movie where you're talking to aliens, where the linguist is all suited up, and she has an image of what would have been like a human word that she's trying to write and translate, but instead it's just the Wordle squares. I loved it.
Well, it's funny you should mention Arrival, because somebody in the Q&A says Xena language was based on the story of your life, the basis for the film Arrival. Did you try to involve Ted Chiang, the author, at all, or have you heard any feedback or reaction from him about the game?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, that story is dear to me, and I read it as a little Kate, and it's like it is the story where the linguist is the hero, and also just says such beautiful things about language and your own self-concept and story and aliens. And so I loved that, and the movie Arrival, and it is the inspiration for this game. We have not directly reached out to to
We've talked to many more science fiction authors. It might be just that we're a little scared. I don't know.
We've met Ted Chiang once.
Years ago.
And it was wonderful. But
great.
but when you meet your heroes, it's just
but he lives there. He's a great guy.
Yeah.
Right? But we're just a little intimidated to bring it to him yet. We're waiting until it's ready, and then we're going to show it to him once it's fully in its perfect package. So.
Yeah. We've been working with a bunch of other, let's say, sci-fi authors as a part of this anthology that we're also putting together. Among them, Ken Liu, Alex Harrow, Max Gladstone, S.B. Divya, great authors. And so we've had at least that experience of the sci-fi coming into us as we curate that with a bunch of short games.
Yeah, I don't think we mentioned this. This is a companion project to Xenolanguage, where we have this anthology that we're doing about playful approaches to first contact. And so we commissioned a number of science fiction writers who each wrote a piece of short fiction about first contact that involves play in some way. Then we also commissioned game designers to make games that will also be in the anthology that fit into sections based on the phases of first contact, I think. So it's this exploration of both short fiction and games together addressing the same topic through play.
Cool.
Yeah, it should be fun too, in terms of talking about authors in science fiction, I guess.
Here's an interesting question. What are some social or linguistic concepts that you're fascinated by that you think would make good games? What are some seeds of ideas that maybe haven't become games yet, but you think could be?
This is right after this call is done, we're gonna have a lot of really great answers to this.
There are fascinations, I think, that are longstanding that we have. This is actually more in the relationship to the overlap of language and cryptography, but there is a very famous book called the Voynich Manuscript that is this untranslated text that people have tried to throw lots of techniques around to get to it. And there's been lots of theories about what it ultimately means and says, but that has been the source of some game prototype ideas from us, not exactly language concepts, but is that we love the idea of language creation as an expression of community. So the idea of twin language, which is something that comes up where twins will have their own way of communicating that they work out together, I think is interesting. The idea of, my background is actually as a computational linguist. And so the idea of language and its place as a tool of humanity and how that is changing radically as natural language processing is becoming much more capable. And I think exploring some of the deeper, ripples through society and what it means to navigate the world when non-humans are regularly using language, I think it will be a really interesting topic.
Yeah, it's a hard question a little bit because I can think of a few things that we're oh, this would be a cool idea to make a game. And the reason why we don't have one is because we tried it and it was terrible, right? One of yeah, exactly. And that was just our approach at it. A more competent person probably would have had a great way of making it into a game.
We're talking about failed ideas now, or?
Well, I mean, that's what I figured, because the only reason why we didn't make it out of a good idea was because we failed at it. But I know at some point I was really interested in there's this concept of visual cryptography where you can take an image and kind of split it into multiple images that when you overlay them on each other or you combine them with different ways, you'll get a message out. Which might just be an image or something like that, but you can also do this in other interesting ways where oh, you can combine it together if 3 to 4 people come together, or you can combine it together with you also have a plausible deniability way where if you combine something else on that original thing, you can make a forged message, right? So oh, I wasn't communicating nuclear codes, right? It's a cookbook, right? And different things like that I was really interested in at some point and tried to do something with, but it was terrible.
For now.
For my attempt at it.
For now.
There's probably much better, and maybe next year we'll have a game.
10,000 hours from now, who knows? Yeah.
Are you working on something you can tell us about?
The two games that we mentioned, Xenolanguage and then the anthology books, those are like our lifeblood at this point. But in general, we love also collaborating, like we said, with other places that are using gaming and language in a unique way. The Aphasia Games for Health was one such project. And we have the beginnings of others, but they aren't kind of publicly shareable.
Yeah, we've done some things with like some video game studios, with with other
Universities,
stuff like that, but they're still hanging in the works.
Well, Catherine and Hakan, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I feel like we only skimmed the surface of all the ways that language and games interact, but I'm delighted to have spent the last hour with you, and I really recommend your games. We do sell dialect at the museum, and please stay tuned for word nights, game nights at the museum. We will do that eventually. And look forward to the next Language and next month when we talk about language and climate. But for now, good night. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Take care, folks.
Tons of fun.